Hannah Clarke arrived for her night shift at Cedar Creek Medical in Atlanta at 10:06 p.m., moving through the automatic doors with the kind of efficiency that made unnecessary motion look impossible. 18 months she'd worked trauma here, and she'd learned to move like water through a corridor, no wasted steps, no hesitation, just the practiced efficiency of someone whose body had learned to conserve energy in places where energy meant survival. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their endless mechanical song, casting everything in that pale blue-white that made living people look vaguely corpse-like. Antiseptic hung in the recycled air like a chemical veil, sharp enough to strip the lining from your throat if you thought about it too long. She didn't think about it. The trauma bay of Cedar Creek Medical sprawled behind the nurse's station like a waiting mouth, 12 beds positioned in a precise circle, monitors already blinking their steady green rhythms. 5 patients tonight. 2 stable post-op, 1 recovering from blunt force trauma, motorcycle accident on I-75, and 2 beds empty, waiting. Dr. Marcus Pierce stood at the far end of the trauma bay, reviewing a chart with a kind of focus that made other people nervous. He was the type of surgeon who moved through a hospital the way a predator moves through territory, not fast, not loud, just with the absolute certainty that everything here belonged to him. Expensive watch, Italian shoes, the kind of composure that came from never being questioned. He was 53 years old, had been chief of surgery for 7 years, and had cultivated a network of hospital board members, insurance executives, and pharmaceutical representatives that made him functionally untouchable. When he looked up and saw Hannah moving through the trauma bay toward the supply station, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It had been the chart reviews that started it. Hannah kept meticulous records, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she'd spent for years in a place where paperwork mistakes got people killed, and old habits had their own gravity. She'd noticed the first discrepancy 6 weeks ago, a surgical supply order for $847 in vascular clamps that didn't match the procedure log for that day. The procedure that supposedly required those clamps had been cancelled. The supplies had been ordered anyway. She'd mentioned it casually to the billing department. Casually. Just as a nurse who noticed things. Then she'd noticed something else. 3 orthopedic surgeries listed on Dr. Pierce's schedule for a Tuesday in March. Only one of them had actually occurred. 2 phantom procedures, with phantom supplies billed to Medicare, with phantom surgical assistant fees that traced back to a company that didn't actually exist. Hannah kept her own private spreadsheet, the kind she worked on during break, the kind she would never mention to anyone. But the spreadsheet was growing, and the numbers in it were getting harder to ignore. Last week, she documented $247,000 in suspicious charges across a 6-month window, all connected to Dr. Pierce's surgical orders, all following the same pattern, charges that didn't match procedures, supplies billed for surgeries that never happened, invoices from medical vendors who seemed to exist only on paper. She knew better than to touch it. She knew better than to care. But something in her, the part that had spent for years keeping people alive when everything was trying to kill them, couldn't just let it sit there and bleed out. Dr. Pierce's eyes tracked her as she moved past him toward the supply locker. His expression didn't change. Surgeons trained themselves to be unreadable, to make their contempt look like professional distance. "Clarke," he said, not quite a greeting. "You're doing the night rotation." "Yes, sir." Her voice came out flat, professional, the way it always did. She'd learned a long time ago that taking up too much space with her voice made people nervous. Better to be the kind of person you could forget was in the room if you weren't paying attention. Make sure the post-ops in Bay 3 and Bay 5 get their 4 antibiotics on schedule. Details matter. He said it like she'd been slacking. She hadn't been. He said it like she needed reminding. She didn't. "I'll handle it," she said, and turned back to the supply station without waiting for him to dismiss her. The thing about working in trauma was that it taught you to read people the way you read vital signs. You learned to recognize the exact moment when someone was about to decompensate, the subtle shift in color, the change in respiratory pattern, the way the body started signaling that it was failing before the numbers on the monitor caught up. Dr. Pierce was compensating for something. The way he'd overemphasized the word details. The way his fingers had tightened on the chart. The way he'd made sure to correct her on something she was already doing correctly. That was compensation. That was a man whose world had developed a crack and who was trying to weld it shut before anyone else noticed. Hannah pulled open the locker assigned to her in the staff break room and hung her jacket on the hook, tucking her worn thermos with its faded USMC sticker into the second shelf. Below that, in a cardboard box that she never opened during her shift, sat the folded flag. It was precisely folded, the way military flags were folded, a tight triangle, blue field on the outside, the red and white stripes hidden beneath. It had come to her 3 years ago from a woman named Sergeant First Class Rebecca Torres, who had written a single line on the envelope, "For Hannah. Because you earned it." Rebecca had been her team lead for 2 of her 4 years in theater. Rebecca had also died from an IED blast outside Jalabad while covering Hannah's extraction from a firefight that went sideways on a Tuesday in autumn when the sky was the color of gunmetal and the smell of diesel and cordite had mixed with something else, something that Hannah had never identified because she didn't need to. The flag had stayed in the locker ever since she'd started at Cedar Creek Medical. 18 months, and she'd never once taken it out except to make sure it was still there. Never unfolded it. Never looked at the stitching or counted the stars or let herself think about what it represented. She didn't believe in symbols much anymore. Symbols were for people who still had the luxury of abstraction. But something about knowing it was there, something about the weight of it, even folded and boxed and hidden, made it possible to move through a day without feeling like she was forgetting something essential. She closed the locker door quietly and headed back out to the trauma bay. Room 408 held Commander David Walsh, recovering from the kind of accident that didn't make sense until you saw the photographs. He'd been driving a 2019 Subaru Outback on Peachtree Street at 4:19 p.m. on a Tuesday, traffic normal, conditions clear, when another driver had crossed into his lane without signaling. The collision had happened at 41 miles per hour. His car had crumpled like paper. He'd survived because his seatbelt had worked and his airbags had deployed and because the emergency response time in Atlanta was 8.3 minutes, which was faster than the national average. He had a broken femur, 3 fractured ribs, a collapsed left lung that had been re-expanded in the ICU, and a concussion that the neurologists were watching with the kind of careful attention that suggested they were worried about something they weren't saying out loud. Hannah delivered his evening vitals check at 11:19 p.m., running her practiced assessment. Temperature normal, heart rate steady at 72, respirations even, oxygen saturation holding at 94% on room air. His color was good. His pupils were equal and reactive. His confusion was improving. Everything indicated trajectory toward recovery. He was the kind of patient who was going to live, and who was going to spend the rest of his life not quite understanding how close he'd come to not doing that. When she was checking his peripheral 4, she noticed something she hadn't seen on her last rotation, a tattoo on his forearm, just above the wrist. Black ink, faded with age, the kind of permanent marking that spoke to a decision made years ago and lived with ever since. Letters. A name. Clarke. Hannah's hands didn't pause. Didn't tremble. Didn't show anything. She finished checking the 4 patency, documented the vital signs in the computer terminal, and left the room without looking at his face. But her mind was already moving, connecting threads, pulling at the edges of something she'd spent 3 years not thinking about. The tattoo meant nothing. Tattoos meant nothing. People got marked with words that didn't matter all the time. Clarke was common. Clarke was, it could mean anything. Service member. Something. Nothing. She found Dr. Pierce in his office at 11:38 p.m., standing at his window overlooking the parking lot below. He was on his phone, speaking in a voice low enough that he probably thought no one could hear him from the doorway. She hadn't knocked. The door had been open. "I don't care if she's been here 18 months, he was saying. "Get me everything. References. Previous employers. I want to know if there are any gaps, any inconsistencies. And pull her healthcare clearance file, check if there are any red flags, any medical history, anything at all that could suggest psychiatric instability." He paused. Listened. "No, I'm not being paranoid. I'm being thorough. This is a liability issue. I want it documented. Another pause. Yes. By tomorrow. Hannah turned and walked back down the hallway before he could see her standing there. But she was already calculating, already thinking 3 moves ahead, already running the numbers in her head. She'd left traces. The spreadsheet, the billing discrepancies, the way she'd asked those careful questions at the department level. Dr. Pierce had noticed, which meant he was defensive, which meant he was moving into crisis mode, which meant this was about to stop being a quiet problem and become something active. The room went dead silent when she pushed the call button for room 408 and found Commander Walsh sitting up, staring at the doorway where she'd just appeared. His eyes moved across her face with the kind of intense focus that suggested he was trying to play something that existed just outside his reach, like a word on the tip of a tongue that wouldn't quite come. "Do I know you?" he asked. And that was the moment when everything that Hannah Clarke had spent 3 years burying started clawing its way back toward the surface. The Grand Rounds conference room at Cedar Creek Medical smelled like antiseptic and ambition. 12 residents and 4 attending physicians filled the space on Thursday morning, their attention fixed on Dr. Pierce, who stood with a patient chart open like he was about to perform surgery on someone's reputation. Hannah leaned against the back wall, her badge catching the fluorescent light, her eyes the color of slate before a storm. She already knew what was coming. She always knew. "Let's discuss Nurse Clarke's cowboy instincts," Pierce began, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a man about to deliver a knife between someone's ribs. He pulled up a medication chart on the monitor, one of Hannah's documentation entries where she'd flagged a dangerous interaction he'd prescribed. Metoprolol and verapamil, both calcium channel blockers, both written on the same order. Cardiac arrest in a bottle. She'd written it in the chart. He'd missed it entirely. "Notice here," Pierce continued, his jaw tightening slightly, how Nurse Clarke decided she knew better than the prescribing physician. A resident in the front row smiled. Not a kind smile. The smile of someone watching a public execution. "This is what happens," Pierce said, turning to face the room fully, when confidence outpaces competence. When someone confuses nursing education with medical training. He let that sit for 3 seconds, a master class in the art of humiliation. Nurse Clarke documented suggestions, emphasis on suggestions, as if her certification somehow equaled my 20 years of surgical experience. He said surgical the way another man might say divine. Hannah's jaw tightened, but only the way a vault door tightens, controlled, complete, final. Her hands hung loose at her sides. She'd learned this in Helmand Province, learned it the hard way: the person who reacts first loses. The person who stays still has already won. Maybe at whatever community college she attended, Pierce continued, glancing at her with the expression of a man examining an interesting bacteria sample, they taught nurses to second-guess doctors. But here at Cedar Creek Medical, we maintain professional hierarchy. Structure. Respect for earned credentials. He set the chart down with deliberate slowness. The residents here should understand something. This is the kind of boundary crossing that causes medication errors. That costs lives. The resident in the front row actually nodded. Hannah waited. Counted 3 heartbeats. The silence in the room thickened like blood clotting, and when she spoke, her voice came out lower than before, stripped of inflection, carrying the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst things a person could survive. "The difference between us, doctor, is that I've actually had to live with my mistakes." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't point. She didn't tremble or look away. She simply spoke as though she was stating a fact about gravity or weather, then turned on her heel and walked toward the door. Dr. Pierce's face reddened, actual color flooding his cheeks, the way a man's face looks right before he throws something. "Nurse Clarke," he called after her, his voice cracking slightly at the edges, "we're not finished here." But she was already gone. Her footsteps echoed down the corridor, measured, unhurried, the sound of someone who had nowhere to run because she'd already run everywhere else. The doors whispered shut behind her, and the room exhaled in that particular way conference rooms exhale when someone has just said something that can't be unsaid. Hannah moved through the hospital hallways like she was made of something denser than air, something that displaced the space around it. Her scrubs were still pristine, her movements still precise, but something had shifted in her posture, a tightening, a settling into herself like a sniper settling into a hide. By early afternoon, she found herself at the vending machines on the 4th floor, feeding dollars into the slot for black coffee she didn't want and probably wouldn't drink. 2 in turn stood 3 machines over, their voices carrying the particular carelessness of people who thought they were far enough away to speak freely. "Think security will finally escort her out," one of them said, the taller one, the one with the kind of jaw that came from people who'd never been hit. "After that little stunt in Grand Rounds." The other one laughed, a sound like broken glass. "Pierce has been building a case for months. References, credentials review, the whole thing. She's done. Questions just when, not if." Hannah retrieved her coffee, which was too hot and too bitter. She didn't turn around. Didn't acknowledge them. Didn't let her shoulders change shape or her breathing shift rhythm. She simply walked away with the same measured pace she'd used to exit Grand Rounds, as though their words were background noise, as though they didn't matter, as though she'd already calculated the distance to the nearest exit. What she didn't do was hurry. Dr. Pierce was at the nurse's station when she passed 20 minutes later. He sat with the Chief of Staff, Dr. Halliwell, his tablet between them like evidence at trial. Pierce was speaking in low tones, the kind of low tones that somehow carry farther than normal speech because people lean in to hear them. Personality disorders that manifest as workplace aggression, he was saying. The kind of person who can't tolerate correction. Who responds to hierarchy with insubordination. Hannah charted at her station, 10 feet away, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the precision of someone who could type military coordinates blindfolded. She didn't look up. Didn't let her pen pause or her breathing deepen. Her eye stayed on the screen, tracking vital signs, documenting medications, recording the precise timeline of care that was her only defense now. But the pen in her other hand, the one she was using to write notes on paper, that pen pressed hard enough into the page to indent not just the current sheet but the 2 beneath it. 3 pages marred by the pressure of restraint. She'd begun noticing the discrepancies in late September. Phantom surgical supply charges that didn't match procedure logs. Medicare billing codes for equipment that had no corresponding entry in the surgical inventory. A pattern that looked almost accidental until you understood how accidents worked, once, twice, and then you were looking at organized error, which was just another word for fraud. Hannah had been a trauma nurse long enough to recognize what she was looking at, the same way a radiologist recognizes cancer in an X-ray. The same way a soldier recognizes an ambush before the first shot fires. She'd kept her own notes. Photographs of discrepancies taken during her breaks, filed away in the second-hand phone she'd bought with cash, the one whose existence Dr. Pierce didn't know about. Not yet. Commander Walsh remained stable in room 408. His vital signs had leveled out, blood pressure normalizing, heart rate steady, the kind of recovery trajectory that suggested his body was willing to cooperate with the plan to survive. But he kept asking her questions. Did they know each other? Had she served? Something about the way she moved, he'd said, something about her hands. Captain Hannah Clarke, the woman who no longer existed in any official database, the woman the United States military had officially erased 3 years ago after a Black Ops extraction in Bagram went sideways, simply deflected. Rest, she told him, her voice careful, controlled, the voice of a nurse and nothing more. Your body needs sleep. He watched her with eyes that had seen things, eyes that recognized something in her that she was trying very hard not to see in herself. I know you, he said. I don't know how, but I know you. She changed his bag without answering. By Thursday evening, Pierce had made his calls. The board members who owed him favors, the ones he'd helped with their own ethical complications over the years, a surgery he'd attributed to someone else, a complication he'd buried in paperwork. Those board members listened when Pierce spoke. The Chief of Staff received an email marked urgent, discussing concerns regarding Hannah Clarke's judgment. An external investigator was quietly retained, tasked with reviewing her employment credentials, verifying her references from her previous hospital in Denver, examining her certification and background. The carefully constructed backstory that had taken Hannah 6 months to build. The paper trail she'd created when the military gave her a new name and told her that Captain Hannah Clarke no longer existed. When they showed her the redacted file, all her service records removed, all her unit assignments erased, all her combat operations classified beyond the reach of normal FOIA requests. They told her she was a ghost now. That bagram never happened. That the extraction operation that went sideways and killed 16 Marines including Corporal Martinez was buried so deep it took them all with it. Hannah opened her locker at 11 p.m. that Thursday night. The folded flag lay exactly where she'd left it, pressed into sharp triangular corners, the fabric worn soft by being held, the weight of it somehow more than gravity should allow. Martinez's colors. Martinez's name embroidered on the edge. Martinez, who died covering her extraction while mortar fire turned the landing zone into something that looked like the earth was bleeding. She held it for exactly 7 seconds. Her hand steady. Her face expressionless. Then she folded it even tighter, a compression, a consolidation, a way of making grief small enough to carry. The hospital was quiet around her. The night shift hum of machines and monitors and the distant sound of the ventilation system working to keep the air clean, keep the environment sterile, keep everything in its proper place. She thought about disappearing again. About walking out of Cedar Creek Medical the same way she'd walked out of every other place that had gotten too close to who she really was. About becoming nothing again, becoming no one, becoming the kind of phantom that couldn't be hurt by a man like Dr. Pierce. But there was a Marine commander in room 408 with her name tattooed on his arm. And that was the moment when everything that Hannah Clarke had spent 3 years burying started clawing its way back toward the surface. Dr. Pierce moved decisively, like a predator that had caught the scent of blood in the water. Monday morning, he submitted the formal complaint to the nursing board, 18 pages, typed on hospital letterhead, stamped with his credentials and his authority. Repeated insubordination. Concerning behavioral patterns. Chart reviews that exceeded her scope of practice. He attached the documentation of their grand rounds confrontation, the exact moment when Hannah had turned to him with that cold flat stare and said, "The difference between us, doctor, is that I've actually had to live with my mistakes." He had the interaction recorded. He made sure the board knew she'd questioned his clinical judgment in front of residents. He recommended psychiatric evaluation. The reassignment came Tuesday morning before Hannah clocked in. MedSurg away from Commander Walsh. Away from trauma. The charge nurse delivered it with apologetic eyes and the kind of gentle tone reserved for people being demoted. Pierce had cited inappropriate attachment to a patient, written it in her personnel file where it would live forever, a permanent stain on her record. Hannah read the reassignment slip twice, processing the strategic brilliance of it. He wasn't accusing her of incompetence, which would be provably false. He was suggesting emotional instability, boundary violation, the kind of accusation that required no evidence, only suggestion. It was a perfect move. Clinical and devastating. She requested to remain on Commander Walsh's care team. Continuity of care, she told the charge nurse. The patient's vitals have been trending. She needs to monitor the patterns. The charge nurse promised to pass it along. 10 minutes later, Pierce appeared in the hallway outside MedSurg, standing close enough that Hannah could smell the expensive cologne he wore like armor. "This is exactly the kind of boundary violation I've documented," he said quietly, his voice carrying the precision of a surgeon. "You're proving my point, Nurse Clarke. The investigation will note this conversation." Hannah didn't respond. She'd learned that Pierce fed on confrontation, that any defense she mounted became evidence of instability. She returned to her MedSurg patients, working through the day with the kind of methodical focus that had kept her alive in Helmand Province, task completion, emotional neutrality, the systematic elimination of variables. But her thoughts kept returning to room 408. Commander Walsh. The arrhythmia she documented. The subtle electrical irregularities on his EKG that were trending in the wrong direction. The disciplinary meeting was scheduled for Monday. 9 a.m. Bring your union representative. Pierce made sure everyone on the floor knew about it. The investigation. the psychiatric evaluation he'd recommended. Hannah heard the whispers at the medication cart, caught the way other nurses looked at her, not with sympathy, but with the careful distance of people protecting themselves. No one wanted to be associated with someone under investigation. It was how hospitals worked. Allegiances shifted like water. Friday afternoon, a woman from HR pulled Hannah into a windowless office on the 3rd floor. Susan Mitchell, title of credentialing specialist. Neutral expression. A file folder on the desk. "We need to verify some information from your application," Susan said, opening the folder with the deliberate slowness of someone who already knew what she would find. "Your reference from Charleston Medical Center. Your previous supervisor." Hannah's chest tightened, but her face remained still. Inside, something ancient and trained locked into place. Threat assessment. Threat response. The reference was positive, Hannah said, keeping her voice level. "Dr. Raymond acknowledged my clinical skills." Susan pulled out a printout. "We reached out for a follow-up conversation. As part of your credentialing review, given the current investigation." She paused, letting the silence do its work. "There's no record of a Dr. Raymond at Charleston Medical Center during the timeframe you listed." "There never was." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Hannah could hear them now, a low electrical drone that seemed to pulse in her skull. She'd fabricated the reference carefully, 3 years ago, when she'd first come to Cedar Creek Medical with a new civilian identity and a social security number that existed but had no employment history. The military had erased her completely. Honorable discharge. Service record sealed. Official denial that Captain Hannah Clarke had ever served, ever existed in any capacity that could be verified. She'd built a new identity from borrowed history and dead names. "I can explain," Hannah said. Susan closed the folder. "The hospital is initiating a full background investigation. Dr. Pierce has requested an external credentialing audit. We're bringing in investigators from an accreditation firm. They'll be here Monday to review your entire hiring file, your references, your licensure documentation, everything." Hannah's phone buzzed in her pocket. She ignored it. "Your disciplinary meeting is postponed until after the investigation concludes," Susan continued. "You're still cleared to work your scheduled shifts, but you won't be assigned to any new patients pending the outcome." "And Nurse Clarke?" "I'd recommend consulting with a lawyer." The office seemed to compress around her. The walls pressed in like they did in those final moments before extraction, when the mortar fire was so close you could feel the heat of it, when everything narrowed to a single point of desperate focus. Hannah nodded once, stood, and left the office without speaking. Her hands were steady. Her breathing controlled. This was what happened when you ran long enough. Eventually, the past caught up. It always did. She drove to the hospital parking lot that evening, sat in her car with the engine off, and stared at the building. Cedar Creek Medical rose against the Atlanta skyline like it was holding up the sky itself. Somewhere inside, Commander Walsh was lying in a hospital bed, vitals degrading, a newer nurse watching his monitors without understanding the patterns. Inside her locker was a folded flag made from the only pieces of her former life that had survived, folded by hands that had held her teammate's body 3 kilometers from the landing zone, under mortar fire, carrying a dead Marine back to the pickup point. Her phone had 3 missed calls. A DC number. Area code she recognized from briefings, from secure communications, from a life that officially didn't exist anymore. She stared at the number on the screen. She didn't call back. Not yet. Calling back meant opening a door she'd spent 3 years keeping sealed. But inside Cedar Creek Medical, Commander Walsh's cardiac monitor showed the early patterns of deterioration that Hannah had documented and Pierce had deleted from the chart. The rhythm was degrading. The electrical activity of his heart was becoming chaotic. At 2:17 a.m., when the night shift was minimal and the on-call physician was drowsy and unprepared, his heart would stop beating. And no one who understood his patterns would be there to save him. Hannah sat in her car, watching the hospital lights flicker in the darkness, and waited for the moment when everything would change again. The code alarm screamed at 2:17 a.m. Hannah heard it from the break room 3 floors down where she wasn't supposed to be. She'd stayed late off shift because something felt wrong, some thread of intuition that had kept her alive through 3 tours in Helmand Province. The alarm was room for 08. Her chest tightened. The commander. She ran. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. The stairwell door burst open. Hannah took the steps 2 at a time, muscle memory taking over, her body moving before her mind caught up. The 3rd floor corridor stretched ahead like a runway. Nurses scrambled toward the code, crash cart rattling like bones in a box. She hit the doorway and stopped. The on-call physician stood frozen beside the monitor, hands shaking, face the color of old concrete. Commander Walsh was flatlining. A nurse was performing chest compressions, shallow, hesitant, ineffective. The monitor showed the flat line persisting. No rhythm. Nothing. "Get me a scalpel," Hannah said. The on-call physician didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the monitor as if staring hard enough might change the numbers. Someone had already called for the crash cart's surgical instruments. The room smelled like fear and antiseptic and something else, that copper tang of blood beginning to pool. "Scalpel," Hannah repeated, louder. "She's not authorized to," the charge nurse started. But Hannah was already moving, already pushing past the frozen doctor, her hands already reaching. The cardiac rhythm wasn't returning. Time was collapsing. The commander had minutes, maybe less, before his brain began dying from oxygen deprivation. She'd seen this rhythm before. She'd lived this rhythm. In Bagram. Under fire. "Where's my scalpel?" Hannah's voice had changed. It was no longer asking. It was commanding. 20 seconds passed. The scalpel didn't come. Hannah reached down and unsnapped her left ankle sheath. The combat knife, the one she'd carried through Helmand Province, the one that had been with her through 3 tours and 4 months of classified operations and a firefight where she'd carried Commander Walsh 3 kilometers under mortar fire, came free with a whisper of leather. "I need a lap pad and suction," she said. She didn't ask this time. Someone moved. Someone else shoved a surgical lap pad under the commander's left chest wall. Hannah's hands were steady as a surgical laser. She'd done this twice before, once in the field with an MRE spoon and a prayer, once in a trauma bay in Kandahar when the surgical suite was too far. Her fingers found the 5th intercostal space, the entry point between ribs, and the knife went in with the precision of someone who'd spent 17 years learning anatomy from the inside out. Blood followed. Dark and hot and urgent. Hannah didn't hesitate. She made the incision, spreading the ribs, opening the chest cavity with movements that were economical and final. The room had gone quiet except for the hiss of the ventilator and the beep of the monitor still flatlined and the sound of her own breathing, steady and controlled. "Get me a hand," she said. No one moved. "Someone put their hand in," she said. Now. Dr. Pierce would have had her removed. Dr. Pierce would have been screaming about protocol. But Dr. Pierce wasn't here. The on-call physician had stepped back so far he was against the far wall, watching like a man witnessing something impossible. Only the charge nurse moved forward, gloved hands trembling slightly. Hannah guided her hand into the chest cavity. "Here. Feel that? The heart. It's not beating. We're going to beat it for him." Hannah's own hands were already there. She reached into the commander's open chest and found the pericardium, that thin sac around the heart, and she squeezed. She massaged the organ with her bare hands, blood to her elbows now, the warmth of it almost alive, almost like it was her own body she was restoring. "Compressions," she said. "Now." The nurses resumed chest compressions above, and Hannah worked the heart from inside, two-handed, the rhythm coming back through her fingers like a prayer answered. 1 squeeze. 2. 3. The monitor beeped. Once. Scattered. Then regular. Sinus rhythm. The room seemed to exhale at once. Someone whispered something that might have been prayer. The on-call physician had turned away, his face in his hands. The charge nurse stared at the monitor as if it might lie. Hannah kept massaging, kept working the heart until the rhythm was strong, until the blood pressure began climbing, until the oxygen saturation started rising. 14 minutes from flatline to rhythm. 14 minutes from dead to alive. ICU prep, Hannah said. Her voice was someone else's voice now. Someone with authority. Someone who'd learned command in the dust and chaos. He's going upstairs. She stepped back. Looked down at her hands, at the blood coating her from fingertips to elbows, and felt absolutely nothing. That was the difference between the military and civilian medicine. In the field, there was no time for feeling. Feeling got you killed. Feeling got your unit killed. The night supervisor was already on her radio, calling Dr. Pierce. Hannah heard that part clearly. We have a situation. You need to get here now. He arrived at 3:15 a.m. in street clothes and fury. Dr. Pierce's eyes swept the trauma bay in a single, calculated glance, Hannah blood-soaked, the commander stabilizing, the combat knife still sitting on the crash cart in plain view. His mouth curved into something that might have been a smile. Get security, he said to the charge nurse. His voice was quiet. Controlled. That's when Hannah knew she'd made a mistake. Nurse Clarke is suspended effective immediately pending investigation of this reckless, unauthorized procedure that violated every protocol we have in this hospital. She performed major surgery without credentialing, without authorization, without surgical privileges. She is a liability. I want her credentials pulled and I want her removed from this building within the hour. She saved his life, someone said. Hannah thought it was one of the interns who'd laughed at her by the vending machines. She violated federal medical licensing law, Dr. Pierce said. He wasn't looking at Hannah anymore. He was looking through her, as if she'd already stopped existing. Get her out. Hannah didn't move. She stood there in the blood and the fluorescent lights, waiting for the moment to shift, for something to change. But nothing did. Security arrived 17 minutes later. They were polite about it. They offered her a bag for her belongings. They escorted her to her locker while the night shift watched. By 6 a.m., her locker was empty. Her badge was deactivated. Her access codes were deleted from the system. By 3 a.m., and Hannah understood the specific cruelty of this timing, she sat alone in a fluorescent-lit diner called the 24-Hour, 3 blocks from Cedar Creek Medical, with cold coffee in a chipped mug and her reflection staring back at her from the window like a ghost that hadn't realized it was dead. The coffee had gone cold an hour ago. The diner smelled like burnt grease and the quiet desperation of people with nowhere else to go at 3 a.m. An old man in the corner booth slept with his head against the window. A couple in a back booth didn't speak, just sat across from each other in the kind of silence that meant all the talking was already done. Hannah stared at herself in the dark window. Her scrubs were clean now, she'd used the hospital bathroom before they escorted her out, had scrubbed the blood away with the methodical focus of someone performing muscle memory, but her face was a stranger's face. Hollow-eyed. Gaunt. A woman who'd been running so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to stop. The folded flag was still in her locker. They'd packed it with her things. She had it now, sitting in the diner bag at the booth beside her. A piece of fabric. A piece of a life she wasn't allowed to claim. She'd saved the commander. She'd performed an emergency field thoracotomy with a combat knife, and she'd brought a man back from the edge of death. But it had cost her everything. Her job. Her civilian identity. Her last thread of connection to the life she'd been trying to build after 18 months of pretending to be someone she wasn't. The waitress refilled her coffee without asking. Hannah stared into the dark liquid and wondered if there was a point where running stopped being survival and started being drowning. At what moment did you accept that the thing you thought was saving you was actually just pulling you under? But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she knew, with absolute certainty, that it wasn't over. That something else was coming. That the man she'd saved, the commander with her name tattooed on his forearm, had just become the most important person in the hospital. And there were people, somewhere in the vast machinery of government she'd thought she'd escaped, who would have heard about what happened tonight. Who would know about the emergency thoracotomy? Who would know about the combat knife? Who would understand exactly what that meant? Hannah raised the coffee cup to her lips. It was still too hot, but she drank it anyway. 3 a.m. in a diner with a cold heart and a folded flag. Everything was about to change. The ambulance arrived at 9:56 a.m. with federal marshals flanking the stretcher. Gunshot wound to the abdomen. Level 1 trauma activation. The ER exploded into motion, nurses calling blood types, tech prepping imaging, anesthesia running lines. The defector was Taliban. Witness protection. That's all anyone needed to know. Hannah moved into the trauma bay without hesitation, her hands already moving on their own muscle memory, assessing the wound with the clinical precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before under worse conditions. The marshal stood at the doorway, weapons visible, ready for trouble that wasn't coming. Then the defector's eyes found hers across the sterile field. Everything stopped. Not actually. The monitors kept beeping, the 4 pumps kept whirring, the fluorescent lights kept their relentless hum. But in that moment, something ancient passed between them. The man's face went white. He tried to move. He couldn't. His lips moved first, then his voice came out like a shattered thing. Jin. Jin. He said her call sign twice, as if the second time would make it real. As if he could summon her from the ashes of Helmand Province and 18 months of civilian camouflage. The nurses froze. The marshals tensed. Hannah didn't move. Her hands continued their work, checking the catheter placement, reading the ultrasound like scripture. She didn't acknowledge him. She didn't blink. But her voice when she spoke was different. Deeper. Colder. Get him stable. Now. The defector kept trying to reach toward her, his voice rising. Jin, it's me, you saved. One of the marshals put a hand on his shoulder. The defector stopped trying. He stared at Hannah like she'd risen from the grave. Upstairs in recovery, Commander Walsh was finally awake. Lucid. The cardiac arrest had broken something loose in him, a clarity that comes after you've died and been dragged back. He'd been asking for the trauma nurse. The dark-haired one. The one who moved like water. Nobody could find her at first. She wasn't in the ER. She wasn't in the ICU. A resident mentioned something about suspension, about Dr. Pierce making accusations, about credential issues. Walsh didn't understand, and he didn't care. He pulled his phone with shaking hands, the satellite-secure phone the Marines had issued him years ago, the one he wasn't supposed to have in a hospital, but nobody was stopping a Marine commander from anything today. He scrolled through encrypted messages, found the citation that had been redacted from his official file, the one he'd memorized anyway because some things matter more than orders. His hands trembled as he opened the audio file. Not from pain. From the weight of years finally catching up. Captain Hannah Clarke, his voice came through the tiny speaker, steady as a general's command, for extraordinary heroism in combat operations under sustained enemy fire. Refused evacuation. Retrieved 3 wounded Marines from a hot zone under mortar fire. Each word was precision. Each word was truth. Mission distance, 3 kilometers. Enemy fire, continuous. Casualties sustained, 0. Citation awarded by 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company, for acts of valor above and beyond the call of duty. He read it aloud to nobody. To everyone. His arm, the one with her name tattooed across his forearm in heavy black letters, the call sign she'd earned the day she carried him through fire, that arm shook like it was bearing weight again. And then the elevator doors opened. A 2-star general stepped out. Not alone. Pentagon officials flanked him like he was escorting the president. The general moved through Cedar Creek Medical the way apex predators move through tall grass, with the absolute certainty that nothing here could touch him. The ER staff didn't move. They just watched. The general found Hannah in the trauma bay and rendered a salute with the kind of precision that could cut glass. His hand came up to his temple like she'd just saved the Republic, which in some ways she had. The commander's eyes went wide seeing it. The defector started weeping. The nurses understood that they were standing next to something beyond their comprehension. The lead official's voice carried across the silent hospital floor like an announcement of war. The Department of Defense is here for Captain Clarke, codename Jin. Her testimony has been declassified. She's needed in Washington. Not a request. A command. Her service record is being restored. Effective immediately. Dr. Pierce appeared at the periphery, his face the color of arterial blood. His mouth opened. He tried to speak. This is clearly some kind of psychotic break. The patient is confused. The nurse's credentials are fabricated. I have evidence. His voice came out like a man drowning. The general didn't even look at him. The official simply said, "Stand down, doctor," and Pierce's words dried up like water in the desert. The 9:33 a.m. patient had been the domino. By 3:15 p.m. that same day, FBI agents entered Cedar Creek Medical with warrants and the kind of grim efficiency that comes from 3 months of surveillance. They'd been watching Pierce for 18 months. Every phantom surgery. Every kickback. Every inflated billing code that added up to $847,000 in Medicare fraud. When Pierce realized what was happening, when he finally understood that he was the subject, not Hannah, he'd panicked. Desperation does terrible things to competent men. He tried to manufacture additional evidence against Hannah. He forged her nursing school transcripts. Altered dates. Created false email chains. Fabricated disciplinary records. It was clumsy. Forensically obvious. It was the work of a man who'd already lost control and was swinging in the dark. The FBI agent showed him the analysis with the kind of professional courtesy you extend to people who are finished. You attempted to discredit a decorated Marine officer to cover your Medicare fraud. That's obstruction of a federal investigation. That adds 15 years to your sentence. Pierce's attorney appeared on Wednesday morning and negotiated a plea deal. The hospital suspended Pierce by Friday. The state medical board revoked his license pending criminal proceedings. He called Hannah's phone 17 times. She never answered. By Thursday afternoon, Pierce was being led out of Cedar Creek Medical in handcuffs. Federal agents flanked him. News cameras captured his perp walk like he was a mob boss, not a surgeon. They loaded boxes of evidence into unmarked vehicles, computers, patient files, the entire architecture of his fraud. Past the vending machines where interns had once mocked her name. Past the ER where she'd saved a life. Past the staff who'd watched her suspended and doubted her and believed Dr. Pierce's narrative. The mask had finally come off. The man behind it wasn't powerful. He was just frightened and desperate and small. Hannah stood at the entrance to Cedar Creek Medical in her dress uniform on Friday at 3:36 p.m. The folded flag was no longer in her locker. It was pressed against her breast pocket now, over her heart, where fallen soldiers belong. Captain's bars gleamed on her shoulders in the Atlanta sun like they'd been waiting 18 months to catch the light. The nurses stopped their work and gathered at the windows. The residents pointed. The residents who'd snickered at the vending machines now understood what they'd never seen: authority doesn't announce itself. It doesn't seek approval. It simply is. Commander Walsh approached on crutches, his gait unsteady but determined. His arm, the one bearing her name, rose in a salute. Not a casual gesture. Not a thank you. A Marine rendering honors to a superior officer. To a legend. The general offered her a choice that afternoon: return to Washington for the declassification hearings, or accept an honorable discharge and stay civilian. Hannah looked back at Cedar Creek Medical. At the trauma bay. At the ER staff. She looked at the commander, at his arm, at the name that had kept him alive through 18 months of buried memories. "I'll testify," she said. "But I'm coming back." Turns out I'm pretty good at saving lives. Muscle memory had carried her through Bagram. Muscle memory had carried her through 18 months of pretending to be someone she wasn't. But the truth was simpler: she was a nurse. She was a Marine. She was Captain Hannah Clarke, codenamed Jin, and she'd never stopped being either one. The Pentagon helicopter waited on the tarmac. Her hands didn't tremble as she boarded. The hospital staff rendered an impromptu salute, not because they'd been ordered to, but because they finally understood what they'd been standing next to all along. The city of Atlanta watched her rise into the sky. And for the first time in 3 years, Hannah Clarke stopped running. If you've never been underestimated, you've never really understood power. Subscribe for more stories about the ones who change everything while the world wasn't watching. Hit that like button if you believe the quietest person in the room might be the most dangerous. And comment, would you have testified? Would you have gone back? Let me know.